As photographers, we've all been guilty at some point in time of over-processing our photos. Sometimes that could be oversaturation, but it usually deals with colors, maybe too much vibrance, or getting a little crazy with the dehaze slider. So how do we know if we've actually taken that too far? Because what you just saw, some of that was an optical illusion and some of that was actually used for commercial use. So we need a way of measuring that, and it goes beyond just soft proofing that we might have done in the old days for printing, but it still can be done. But there are ways to measure this as you're editing to make sure that you're not pushing it too far if you're not supposed to be pushing it too far. So I'm going to cover that. Also, what's really going on behind the scenes when we're working with this saturation, and would it really be a problem anyways? So first off, there are 3 saturation adjustments to be aware of, and they all handle things a little different. The first one is, of course, saturation. You'll see a saturation slider typically in software, or a saturation adjustment layer, and of course that just saturates all the color. But then we have vibrance and we have dehaze, and those overlap, and they really shouldn't be used necessarily if you're already using very much saturation, because vibrance does saturate colors, but it first selects the muted colors. So colors that are already a little bit on the dull side of an image, then if you use vibrance, it'll then brighten those up. It'll then get a bit more saturation to those dull areas. Now, dehaze does the exact same thing, except instead of using the muted colors, it uses muted colors that are affected by atmospheric haze. So it's judging how much haze would be on that photo. Based off the colors, it knows what haze would be. So you've got 2 different muted color saturation tools, which are vibrance and dehaze. And if you use them both at the same time, you're going to have an overlapping area that will cause an oversaturation. Now also, just to clarify, there is no real technical thing as oversaturation. Saturation has a high limit, and that's as far as a color can go. So for instance, if you were to take a look at red, which on RGB would be 25500, that is 100% saturation. You just can't go any further than that. So you can't go beyond what red is red. Now typically we never see a full red color of anything. They'll usually be in different hues and different amounts of saturation. Same way when we talk about blues, there's no crystal clear blue water or blue sky that is pure blue, because that would be then the RGB of 255. And once you hit that limit, then it's 100% saturation. You can't go any further than that. So when we take a look at something on a monitor, we hit 100% saturation. It's not damaging anything. It's not like we lost information like you would if you were in the clipping area when you're looking at the clipping of highlights or clipping of whites or clipping of blacks. So the saturation just hits that limit, but it can look unnatural. So we really don't want to have something hitting the 100% saturation mark, which is what we would consider to be oversaturation. Let's dive into this and let's take a look at how we can actually detect what's going on and then how to correct it. So what we'll do is start with this image here, which you gotta love it or you gotta hate it, because this was one of those that when I shared it on social media, I had a lot of people loving it, and then of course I get criticism, and yeah, you'll always get criticism on social media, no surprise there. But that's because this has this big neon area of the front porch. Now, selling this as a house in real estate photography, that really did stand out. But is it too much? We're going to take a look at that, but also then a beach scene, which looks very nice. If we were to come straight out of camera, it's an extremely dull, raw file. So we'd want to pump that up a little bit and probably remove the trash cans as well. But also then taking a look at one of my favorite shoots this past year, and that was over here at Lake Sherwood. I got to spend the evening at this house, had it all to myself with great views, got all kinds of great footage. It was a great gig overall, an all-day job with considering everything else we did for it, but capturing that sunset that was going down across the lake, it looks like it's over-processed, but believe it or not, it hardly is. This is where some of the optical illusions come in, so let's start measuring it. How do we know if we've hit the point of 100% saturation, which is what we would consider to be oversaturated? Well, there's 2 tools that are involved with doing that. Now the first thing is to be able to take any color and you can detect what the amount of saturation is on it. And what you can do is simply use the color picker tool, and with the color picker tool you can sample a color and then check what its HSB values are. So that's hue, saturation, and brightness, and what we'd be interested in here is the saturation amount. So if I clicked here on the grass, for instance, I can see that the saturation is just 61%. If I click in this neon area over here, I can see that it's high, but it's only 75%. But that's deceiving. That also is an illusion because this isn't the only tool we should use. So let's just close this out. What you want to do to really check this level of saturation is use an inversion layer. It's very simple. This is how it's done. You want to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and then you want to add an invert layer. So when you add that, and you can name it whatever you'd like, then it'll look very strange. It'll be inverted. It'll be inverting your colors. What you want to do next is change its mode from normal into color. Then you want to change its opacity down to 50%. Now, you should see at this point a completely black and white grayscale image. But as we can see here, we're not seeing complete black and white. We're seeing some colors, and sure enough, a lot of that is coming from two areas. One, we're seeing the shutters, and we're also seeing some yellows shine through here. So this allows us to then better detect what areas might be really hitting that 100% saturation mark. So now that we see these colors, what we can do is go down to the layer that we're working on, and we can then use the color picker tool. And right now I'm just going to set it to current and below because you could be working with multiple layers here when you're processing this file. Now using this, I can go in here and select some of these colors and watch what happens then on saturation. So here then I immediately see I'm at the 100% saturation mark on that color. So when I was trying to detect it before, it was this color down here, you can see, which was a yellow, which wasn't 100% saturated, but what I've done here, I've hit a point of 100% saturation with this color. I can sample around and see what other colors might be hitting it, and off to the side here where it was dull, it was only 64%. When we get into the brighter areas, sure enough, where our saturation goes up, and eventually we hit this 100% point. Same way too on the door. If I click on the door, it's 100% saturation in the red. And if you want to verify that, you just turn off the invert layer and you can see that is neon red. So what we want to do is just tone down those areas a little bit. But what's going to happen is it's not just reducing the saturation, we also have to change the brightness. As you might recall from an earlier video I did on white balance, when we adjust the color, especially these advancing colors of reds and yellows, if we reduce them, we'll also reduce the exposure, we'll reduce the brightness. So we have to take that into account. So what I want to do, now that I know the color and where that area is that I was selecting it from, I want to select that color range. So we can go to Select, and then Color Range, and then using this tool, I can then click inside there to where I see it. And I can see that it's lighting up that porch. If you want to see it better, then instead of selecting Selection Preview as None, select it as Grayscale. And now we can see it better. So now we're seeing that area, and you can click around here too to see if you're really getting that area that you were after that was 100% saturated. And you can adjust the fuzziness here to kind of get within that range. We're just going to right now say OK, and you can see that it's selected a good amount of those colors. Now what we want to do is feather this even more. So I'm going to go to Select, and then we want to go to Modify, and we want to feather this by something large. I'll feather it by 50 pixels and say OK. So I'm going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and then Hue Saturation Layer. And you can name it whatever you like. In this case, I'll say yellows, because that's what we're really after here, to desaturate that yellow area that we selected. So now that I've got that selected, I can lower the saturation. So I lower it down to where I see that maybe that's going away, but how do I verify it? We turn back on our invert mask. And now we can see that this area is more grayscale. If I turn off our desaturation layer, you can see there's a difference. But what's also happening though with this is we're losing our brightness. So for instance, if I turn that layer back on, you can see it got dull. I'll zoom all the way out here, and you can see that now that area lost some of its brightness. So what you want to do is, as you're desaturating any of these advancing colors, and we tone that down, you might want to bring up the lightness slider. And that will then bring in some of that luminance, just like that. So you can play around with that to see where you are. And once again, does that look like it's a neon color? Well, not compared to what it was if you turn this off, you turn that on. So that helped tone it down. Now we would do the same things again just for the reds, but was it acceptable? Yes, I actually delivered this particular image to the client. This is the hero shot that they used on the top of the MLS listing. But really, it should have been more along the lines of this. That would have probably been better. And of course, since this has a mask, you can put in more, you can take out some. So you can keep changing this as you want. But let's take a look at the next example, because this gets really tricky. This is in the blues, and this is different. This is a receding color, not an advancing color. So blues by nature are dark. The yellows are very bright, but blues are dark by nature. So to find the saturation here is going to be a little tricky. Now, I overprocess this, I know it. Here's the raw file, and of course then here are my adjustments on it. But how do we know if it was oversaturated? Well, once again, we can use the color picker tool, click in the blue areas of the sky, and we can see it's 100% saturated. But if we were to test it with the inversion layer, we're going to get something different, and we need to modify that just a little bit so we can also see then the areas that will be affected. So once again, we'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll do an inversion layer. And what we'll do is we will change its mode into color, and then we'll change its opacity to 50%. Now, it doesn't look like anything is oversaturated here. I can zoom in here and it looks like a black and white image. And that's because blues are darker than yellows. So in this case, instead of a 50% opacity, we may have to change that to about 40%. And now you can start seeing where those oversaturated areas are. So it gets tricky with oversaturated blues. But here it's the same thing. Once I see that area, then I can detect it. I can say, yep, that's it. That's the 100% saturation. So now I can select that color range. And to do that, I know it's in this area. I'll shut off the inversion layer. I will go here and select my color range by going to Select and Color Range. And then if you don't see the colors, then what you want to do is change it from grayscale to none. And then I'll just click in here and I can see what it's selected. And of course I can go here to grayscale and get a good idea. Now, are those the colors that I was really after? I think they are. We can once again verify that with our inversion layer. But you can change the fuzziness as you see fit. And I'll just click OK. Now, are those the areas that should be? Well, we can turn on the inversion layer and we can see, yeah, that did select the colors that we were after to desaturate. So once again, I'll feather this. I'll go to Select, Modify, and then we will feather this by 50 pixels, and then Layer, Adjustment Layer, and then a Hue Saturation Layer that will now have that mask on it. And I could have called that blue. But with that selected then, I can now decrease that saturation for that selection. And it doesn't really take much to do that. So let's dock this real quick and we can measure that. So we can turn back on our inversion layer and we can see it looks like it's pretty good. But let's do a real measurement. I'm going to select just the properties right here, not the mask. And now when I select the color picker tool, if I say current and below, it'll take into account that hue saturation layer. So now I can click over here and sure enough, the saturation is down to 85%. And I can keep clicking in here and I'm not seeing anything that's 100. If I say OK and I turn off this and then I click again within this area, then I can see that I'm at 100% right off the bat, easily 100%. So this layer did help, definitely did help get rid of that saturation in the blues. Once again, it's deceiving because blues are darker. But magenta is another tricky thing, and we can see that if we go to this example. In this image, you might think it looks unnatural and overprocessed because of these cotton candy clouds. Well, let's measure those real quick. If we take our color picker tool and we go in here and click around, the saturation is actually very low. We're only at about 13, 15, maybe 20% saturation. What's throwing us off here is that our brightness is really high. So we're seeing this magenta just in a very, very bright area, and it's throwing us off, giving us this optical illusion that it's oversaturated when it's not. So this image here isn't overprocessed at all and doesn't need to have any further adjustments done on it. But that's also relying on what we're seeing on a monitor. How about when it comes to printing? This is where it gets a little tricky. Now, if you were to do soft proofing in Lightroom, and you might have seen tutorials on that, it's something I do not recommend. I'm not going to bother showing it because they use that ProPhoto RGB color space. It's not going to be accurate to what you're working with. You should be working in sRGB if you're working in the real estate photography stuff, where it's all going to be seen mostly on the web, and most of the stuff you'd be doing also for the web would be in sRGB, stuff that I talk about in my books and my courses. And by the way, if you're not familiar with that, I do have online courses on doing professional interior photography, expert editing, also professional exterior photography on doing shots particular like this, and I also have a course on doing videography for real estate as well. And I've written best-selling books on real estate photography, and I have links to all that down in the description for this video. But in particular too, there's a book that I have called Mastering Color in Photography, and it's going to show you some of this soft proofing that I'm going to talk about next. And what that is where we would take an image and see what it would look like if it was printed. Now this gets tricky because it depends on who's going to print your photo. If you print your own photo with your own printer, it will have ICC profiles. If you're using a lab like bayphoto.com, they'll have instructions for using ICC profiles, and they also will provide you, and these are just some of their instructions, they have different profiles you can download. So let's say that we were going to do some printing at their lab, and we were going to use luster. So what we would do is we would download this ICC profile and install it, which is very easy. They've got instructions to do that. And then when we're in Photoshop, we can select that. And what you would do is go up to the View menu and go to Proof, Setup, and then go to Custom. In Custom then, you can select which one of those you want. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and here's a couple from Bay. Here's the one for photographic luster. So if I select that and I say OK, now I can see how it's going to be printed by Bay Photo. If I want to toggle that on and off, you would go and toggle off Proof Colors. So let's toggle that off, and you can see nothing changed. This is basically the same way that this would be printed. So we were well within gamut for what they would be printing. But let's say we wanted this as a metal print on a wall display. So I could download their metal print ICC profile, and I can select that instead. So I could go up here to View, Proof Setup, select Custom, and then instead of the luster, let's select then their metal prints. And that happened to install all the way down here, so Bay Photo metal prints. So let's select that and see if that changes anything. And really, for the most part, it really hasn't changed at all. We'll click OK, and we can change that on and off once again by just clicking Proof Colors or Control Y. If we click off Proof Colors, it changed a little bit. Let's do Control Y, and we can see that it is changing a little bit. We'll do Control Y again, and if we go back and forth, we can see there's a slight bit of a difference. But at least with this, we can see then, well, is it going to print okay? Well, right now, this would print. This is how it would look if it were printed on their metal wall displays. So I can, though, once again, just shut that off, and this is how it should look on the web. Now, once again, everybody's going to have a different calibration on their monitor, and if somebody's looking at your photos while they're on a phone or some other device like a tablet, where the colors are going to shift at night so that it also dims the screen and maybe warms it up a little bit, the colors are going to shift as well. But when you deliver properly processed photos, you'll know how they should look, and then it's up to the device and how somebody has set that up to determine how they will see it.